everyone, I'm Sostine and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to make a really ruffled shirt for my husband. As long as I can remember, my single favorite thing to see on a man was a ruffled 18th century shirt. You know, the ones with the open front, the ruffles, the dropped shoulders, and puffed sleeves. It was just like the sexiest thing you could possibly put on a man to me. I think this explains why my single favorite men growing up were Ioan Gruffudd as Horatio Hornblower in an 18th century shirt, Tom Cruise in a ruffled shirt, Brad Pitt in a ruffled shirt, and so forth. And you'll notice two of these are from Interview with the Vampire in the 1994 movie. And of course, this is Tom Cruise before he started jumping on couches. I actually love the shirts in this movie, and I always have been so obsessed with them. I think the way that they've been sewn up is just absolutely beautiful. And the little movements that the characters do with the shirt, like pulling the ruffles out, and the sleeves is just a delight and adds so much to the fastidious, self-righteous characterization of the vampires themselves. So Gideon, do you want to come up? Good boy. And sorry about the headphones around my neck this week. This is literally the only microphone that I have left in my Airbnb because my dog literally chewed through the cable while I was recording. And I will take that out of his next vet bill. On the ruffles in their coat adds so much to the fastidious, self-righteous characterization of these vampires. And so for years, I've been making these shirts as well. And today, I'm going to show you how I do it. But before I do, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Cometeer. So once upon a time back in medical school, I decided to add caffeine to my daily routine to increase my work efficiency. This started with a simple Diet Coke in the morning, and then it became 2. And now, more than a decade later, I am a coffee addict and have to have 2 cups of very strong coffee a day to be remotely functional as a full-time working adult with a YouTube channel and a small child. Recently, since I'm moving to New Jersey, I had to pack away my machine and looked into having a coffee service for a few months that wouldn't need its own particular machine. And in this way, I have discovered a completely new and awesome way of drinking coffee. So Cometeer is a coffee company that brings you flash frozen capsules that you can just pop in your freezer when you get them in the mail. In the morning, you can either make hot coffee by adding hot water to your frozen coffee, or if you prefer iced coffee, you can actually defrost it in your fridge overnight and just pour it into ice and water. And there you go, perfect iced coffee. One of the recipes online also suggests adding it to steamed milk for a cappuccino experience, which I cannot wait to try. Unfortunately, my milk steamer is currently all packed up in my new house in New Jersey. So while I'm in this Airbnb in Illinois, I'm just gonna have to wait to try that. It's so easy, and the error rate for pre-coffee steam has been way lower with Cometeer because it turns out that microwaving water is actually easier than fiddling with the machine. On top of all this, the packaging is completely recyclable, and honestly, the coffee is so delicious. It's genuinely good. I've tried about 4 of the flavors now, and they've all been fantastic. I think I personally prefer the darker brews, but I think that's just my coffee addict speaking. They all have wonderful notes of coffee while not having an overly bitter aftertaste, so much that my husband requested that we stick with Cometeer versus our other coffee service, even when we get back to Jersey. And I've happily agreed. This also means I get more counter space. For a limited time, you can receive $60 off across 4 boxes using the link in my description. Thank you, Cometeer, for sponsoring this video and also saving me from myself in the mornings. Now, let's get back to making the shirt. And I try to make mine as historically accurate. Hi guys, Editing Steen here. The next 2 minutes, the audio quality was absolutely terrible, so I had to re-record it. I apologize, and the hair and makeup sucks, but the content should be about the same. So of course, when I make my shirts, mine have tiny, delicate ruffling and tiny stitching, and I try to make mine as historically accurate as possible. Not necessarily because I feel like historically accurate is intrinsically better or anything, because goodness knows normally I have an obsession with machines like my Baby Luck Venture. However, in this situation, I do feel like there is a beauty to these shirts that come from being hand sewn, and I'd like to take a moment to talk about the beauty of these shirts and the history here. So back in the 18th century, men wore these shirts as underwear, and a typical person would actually own 7 of them, one to wear every day of the week, and they would actually be numbered thusly for the laundry woman to follow along with. These shirts actually fell almost to the knee, and the reason for that is that they would tuck these shirts around their genitals and between their legs to wick up sweat. In this way, they didn't actually have separate underwear like boxers or briefs today, but these shirts still acted as a barrier between their skin and their clothing. So the clothes that they wore every single day, like their linen breeches, wouldn't get dirty
dirty, sweaty, and could be washed less frequently. In fact, these shirts were such an essential part of personal hygiene that changing one's shirt was about the equivalent of taking a personal shower. By the way, so I do want to say 18th century men and women were in fact very hygienic. Typically, these shirts were made with linen. The rich also wore shirts made of linen, but their linen was white, and the poorer classes would honestly wear a check or a colored linen, as these shirts would stain less and be easier to clean than white shirts. Generally speaking, just the act of keeping something white was very expensive. So another beauty of these shirts was that they were made entirely out of squares and rectangles, all sewn together in creative ways to give ample range of motion, be incredibly comfortable, and just be overall, in my opinion, very attractive. At the same time, it's a ton of work to make one of these shirts. The pattern I used actually calculated that it took 20,649 hand stitches to make just one of these shirts. Something I absolutely believe, having done this about at least 5 or 6 times now. And I do love doing it. Now, let's get back to the Vampire Lestat shirt from the movie. And this ends at editing scene 5.
Now, incidentally, I actually know the person who made the shirts for both Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, as well as a lot of the other cast members. Her name is Gwen Russell, and she and her business partner, Janet Haslam, actually made the shirts for this movie, as well as several other amazing costumes, namely the ones that Yvette wears, as well as the one on the Poodle Lady, both of which are probably my 2 favorite gowns from that entire movie. And of course, Gwen worked closely with the Sandy Powell to make these shirts a reality. Also, as a side note, if you don't know who Sandy Powell is, she is an incredible costume designer who has been nominated for Best Costume Design 15 times now, winning 3 times, and has designed the costumes for some of my favorite movies of all time. So Gwen Russell actually explained to me in an interview with me that they actually tried their best to make these shirts as historically accurate as possible.
She did the original standard pattern, and you're absolutely correct, based on original. I mean, everything we did on that film, it was based on original.
Taking the patterns from actual historical shirts. Honestly, it's really easy to believe when you look at it. You can see clear historical influence from the gussets, the placement of the binding on the shoulder. The seams are all where I know them to be personally from my own research, and the measurements are all very close to the historical excellence I've actually seen myself. So as far as I can tell, and they did a really good job. One thing I did have to ask about was this.
So I noticed that the shirts were mostly cotton, but historically they would have been linen, correct?
Yes, but she went for cotton because and also it's to do with the heat underneath the lights and everything like that.
Yeah. Apparently this was a deliberate choice, as one, cotton would show the wear and grime of being worn much more easily than linen, and thus would add to the drama of the scene visually. And honestly, that philosophy worked. She also explained that cotton dries much faster than linen, so they could wash these shirts overnight much faster. You can totally see it in the different scenes, and looking back at these movies, these shirts are worn in practically every scene. I personally think it's because Sandy Powell must surely agree with me. Men look good in an 18th century shirt. Let's get back to the making of one of these. As I mentioned, I will be using a historically accurate, meaning all fully hand sewn method for sewing this shirt, which is honestly a first for this channel. I am using the pattern from At the Sign of the Golden Scissors and a delightfully soft linen from Zadie Grossman. I got 3.5 yards for this shirt. I think you could get away with around 2.5 to 3 yards if your shirt wearer or husband isn't 6'3" and broad shouldered, but it turns out I have a type. Now, 18th century shirts, you can think of it this way. You make 4 different parts: the collar, the left sleeve, the right sleeve, by the way, which both sleeves are completely identical. They're not even mirrored. And then the body portion, and then you sew all 4 parts together. So let's start with the sleeve, because the big puffy sleeve, I mean, that's such a signature. One thing I love about this pattern from At the Sign of the Golden Scissors is that they have different shirt patterns depending on what decade of the 18th century you're sewing for and what class of individual. And this is all in one book. You might have noticed I don't exactly do working class impressions just because I like fancy stuff. So of course I went to the high class 1780s shirt instructions. I did some measuring on the husband, and then I used simple math to figure out what size pieces I needed for each piece. And of course the book walks you through all that. Now, when you're sewing shirts, to make sure you have exactly the right size shapes and to decrease the amount of fraying, you actually pull a single thread in the fabric weave itself to figure out where to cut these pieces. And then you use a pair of scissors. I like to use scissors by Ginger, and I cut along that single thread on all 4 sides. And this results in pieces that are perfectly symmetrical and also fray very little, especially in the type of meticulous sewing that I do for this. I spent a really lovely evening just pulling thread and cutting out all of the pieces and labeling it. I then started with the sleeve. Now, one really cool thing about 18th century sleeves is that at many points they feature something called the stitch. As referred to in the book, it's basically a backstitch that is used along a single thread of the fabric and stitched every 3 to 4 fibers of the weave. The stitches are sewn end to end, back to back, so it honestly looks really amazing and makes that edge just also very strong. So it's both functional and gorgeous, and also just really meticulous. It is required at the collar and at the sleeve edge, so I folded in the seam allowances and did the stitch at the appropriate points. Please note that unlike modern seams where you get the piece of fabric and you put it right side to right side, put in a few seams on the machine and turn it inside out, these shirts weren't really made like that. Instead, the tiny, tiny shirt seam allowances were actually painstakingly folded and pinched by hand, and the edges were then wedge stitched together close, wrong side to wrong side. By tiny seam allowances, I really do mean tiny. I think that the guide recommends a 1/4 or up to like a 3/8 inch seam allowance versus the 5/8 inch seam allowances that we use in modern sewing. This actually saves a lot of fabric, believe it or not. I also put in 2 1/2 inch buttonholes by hand on either side of the sleeve binding. Then I hemmed in the open part of the sleeve, 3 inches at both sides using a very narrow 1/8 inch edge, folded twice, and then started gathering up the far edge of the sleeve. To do this, I marked with thread the 1/4, 1/2, and 3/4 point, and then gathered up each quarter with 2 rows of gather stitches. Now these are exactly parallel to each other, in fact to the point that where every stitch ends where the next stitch on both parts. And then they're gathered for every 4 fibers of the weave itself. That way when you gather it up, you have some really gorgeous and tiny gathers. I know it sounds like a ton of work, but I just love how these look on a finished shirt, so of course I had to include this detail. This only added 8 hours of my life to all of this. These gathers were actually stroked with a pin upwards up the sleeves so that they were all parallel to each other, and they honestly look so good that I do make a point of doing it myself for formal occasions. You could see these stroked gathers in many 18th century paintings on people's shifts and shirts, so you know that they took pride in these tiny little details. Once these are all gathered up, I then sew it to the sleeve bindings that I've already prepared and then sew them on at edge. I sew these by getting the needle and then picking up a single gather and then sewing it to one edge of the sleeve binding, and then picking up the next with another stitch all the way down. I use a piece of strong 30-weight silk thread for all my sewing, heavily waxed, so that of course it is both strong and attractive. I go 1/4 of the gather at a time so it's not overwhelming until all the quarters are done. After this, I sewed the sleeve together using a hand seam where I fold over both edges and lock the raw edges in between together and then sew it down. This way all the raw edges are completely encased in the fold and the shirt is less likely to break down with multiple washes. At the top of the seam in the armpit, I put in a square gusset so that there is extra fabric in the armpit, thus allowing wonderful freedom of arm movement. I did this twice to make 2 sleeves. Now for the collar, it was very similar to the making of the cuff, except of course much larger. I added in 2 buttonholes and 2 linen buttons to the shirt collar as well. These linen buttons are the favorite buttons for 18th century shirts since they don't get too beat up in the wash. Now it was time to make the body of the shirt. For the body of the shirt, I started with a long piece of fabric. That we're talking long. Has to go from about a couple of inches above the knee all the way up to the shoulder and all the way back down. So for my husband, it was about 84 inches. Now, this is very different from modern day sewing where these are separate pieces and then they're seamed together at the shoulder. 18th century shirts are not like this. They're actually made in one piece and then just reinforced where it's going to get the most wear at the shoulder. Matt is 6'3", so we're talking about an extra long piece, and it was about 84 inches in length for him. I got this large piece of fabric and found the center line along the side and pulled a single thread at that center point. I followed this thread along to the middle and cut a perfect T at the center here for the neck. Meanwhile, at the very front, I turned in a very tiny hem about 1/8 of an inch wide twice and then stitched that down by hand. At the very bottom, I did do some buttonhole stitches to reinforce this area, but I also put in a heart-shaped reinforcement on the inside. It's only visible on the outside from the tiny pinprick stitches, and it makes me so happy that this is a real historically accurate thing that people did in 18th century shirts. I hope that he looks at it and is reminded that someone who loves him made it for him. Once this is done, a lot of different things need to also be done. For instance, the neck gusset hem has to be folded and the stitch added and then sewn onto the neck sides. Afterwards, the binding seam is folded, again pulling a single thread out so that it is perfectly straight and even, and then pinned or basted to the shoulder. This shoulder strap is sewn at the midline of the shirt so that there is extra support at the top of the shoulder where it's going to get the most wear. And of course, this is all sewn down using the stitch, which is very strong and attractive. But this time it goes through all the layers and it's just so pretty. You'll notice that there is something very similar, if not exact, on Lestat's shirt in Interview with the Vampire as well, in many scenes. Now the body of the shirt is all done. And now this has to be added to the neckline. The neckline was then gathered up and sewn to the collar using a very similar technique to the sleeves, 2 rows of very tiny gathers. These sleeves were also appropriately gathered and then stitched down to the top of the shoulder. Once this was all done to both sides, all there was left to do was sew in the sides of the shirt, leaving an 11-inch gap along the bottom of the shirt so that there was room for leg movement. I hemmed this bottom, and the shirt was mostly done. Some would say all done. Now I suppose it could be considered done, but of course we're making a ruffled 18th century shirt, thank you. And this is currently sans ruffles, and the ruffles are so important. FYI, do not be fooled by 1970s costumes. They show a ruffled thing that they call a jabbet in a lot of these costumes. I'm looking at June 1970s Poldark. They weren't really a thing in the 18th century. Like an 18th century person has no idea what a jabbet is. The shirts did have a long piece of fabric, usually much finer than the shirt itself, often like a linen cambric that was hand hemmed, gathered, and then sewn to the neckline of the shirt. They would then tie a piece of linen called a cravat around their neck. Now, of course, this is not a jabbet. This is just what happened when Victorians tried to mimic the 18th century look without doing proper research. So don't wear a jabbet, just add ruffles. For mine, I hemmed a super long piece of linen cambric by hand, gathered it up, and sewed it to a piece of cotton tape for strength. The ruffles I used were 1 to 2 in length. The neckline was about 22 inches, so it was about 44 inches long. I then sewed it on to a piece of tape and then sewed that on to the neckline all the way around. And now the shirt was done. Overall, I love the way these shirts look. I'm particularly proud of this one because I feel like the pleats came out extra pretty, and I'm excited for him to possibly get to wear it at Versailles this year because I will be trying to go to Fête Gallant. It's so comfortable, and perhaps no one else will notice these tiny little details like the binding on the shoulder and the gathers at the sleeve, but I just love seeing it myself. When my husband wears his 18th century shirts, they make me so happy. And honestly, if you don't sew to make yourself happy, why are you sewing? So that's my story. So I do apologize. I've been shooting in random Airbnbs. As you can see, I've been making do with what I have that my dog has not destroyed yet. And before we settle in my house in Jersey, thank you for putting up with my very bizarre airing set schedule and my odd filming materials. And thanks for watching. If you do want to watch me build up another sewing room, please don't forget to subscribe and don't forget the bell. Gideon, oh, what a good boy. You didn't actually chew through my wires.
Hi guys, Editing Steen here again. I really wanted to add something about this movie. In both the movie and the book, Louis is a slave owner, and this really didn't sit well with me because he had this whole moral dilemma about being too morally good to drink the blood of humans, but he really didn't feel bad about being a slave owner. I felt like this was handled really badly in the 1994 movie since it really never addressed it. I do think that the movie and plot are both deeply flawed, but I also wanted a chance to showcase the amazing work of my friend Gwen Russell and all the other people who worked so hard on the costumes. Nevertheless, I didn't want to put out a video into the ether that didn't even acknowledge the mistakes of the past, and at the very least, I wanted to take the time to mention that there are things that this movie did very wrong. So, thank you again for watching, and hopefully see you in a month.